Hello, ladies. This is probably not one of the topics that we want to ever have to talk about, but I think that whether this is something that you are concerned about for somebody that you know, or if you're not totally sure about what's going on in your relationship, and if it's something that maybe coaching or therapy should be appropriate for, or if it's something more along the lines of abuse, I think the more information that we all have, the better, the more that we can help other people in our lives, the more clarity we can have about what is going on in our own relationships. And so I'm so grateful that Rebecca Saleman agreed to come onto the podcast with me today. You're going to hear an amazing conversation. We were discussing a lot about what we would look at, what would be normal in a normative marriage or an unhealthy marriage, and then what makes an unhealthy marriage different than an abusive relationship. And I think it's just a really, really valuable conversation to have. I'm not going to reiterate why, because we talk about that inside the podcast episode. I do want to make one more pitch. She describes really clearly what Shalom Task Force is there to provide. And I didn't know that going into interview her. I really wasn't that clear on what the people on the hotlines are trained to do for the people who call. And I think it's really, really helpful information. I'm so glad that I have it, because I think that now, whenever I'm in a situation where I might have to refer somebody or make that suggestion, I just am a much better advocate with this information in hand. And again, like I said in the beginning, like we say throughout the podcast, we don't want to have this resource, but we do, and we do need it. And as long as we need it, the more people who can know about it, the more people who can make those references, the more people who can encourage people to call, or even just put up flyers in the shul bathroom, whatever it is that you're doing, the better. So I hope that you gain as much as I did from this interview, and I will leave it there. Rebecca Saleman, thank you so much for coming on and speaking to us today on the How to Glow podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So I just told Rebecca her background is super, super impressive, but I'm going to let her introduce herself. I'll include the link to her bio on the show notes so people can read it if they would like to.
Thank you. I graduated with my MSW, and prior to that, I had actually done some just college intern work in prevention education for teen dating violence. And then I meandered through a little bit of work in the foster care system and actually some teen pregnancy prevention work. But then I found myself back in the domestic violence world, which was where I had just really found very meaningful when I had been doing it back as a college intern. And so I've been with Shalom Task Force for just about 2 years. I started on December 1st of 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic. And yeah, so in that time, I've been in the role of director of hotline services. So I oversee our about 60 volunteers who staff on the hotline through shifts throughout the day, providing insight and support to them, as well as making sure that we are staying up to date with best practices in the field and making sure that they have the resources and support that they need to do that work. When I started, we had just launched a chat line. And so that is really the same support. We provide very much the same type of support that we do on the hotline, but in the modality of WhatsApp, SMS, texting, or through our website. And so we've been working really hard to train volunteers for that program as well. And so, yeah, so that's who I am and where I am right now.
So zooming out, for people who haven't heard of Shalom Task Force before, who do you work for and who is it for, and what's the sort of overall vision of the organization?
Absolutely. So Shalom Task Force was founded at this point about 30 years ago. And it was actually founded, one of, I think, the just really neatest things about it is, like I said, we have about 60 volunteers. And so many of those volunteers were present and very kind of the integral to the founding of the organization. But there was a pediatrician in Far Rockaway who was seeing abuse cases in his Jewish patients, and particularly Orthodox Jewish patients. And he didn't know what to do with them because people didn't feel comfortable reaching out to abuse services outside of the community. And he approached a handful of women, women who were just very active in the community, and said, do something. And so with that, the hotline was born. Wow. And so the hotline primarily serves, our area of expertise is Orthodox Jewish survivors of domestic violence. And as we'll talk about more a little bit later in related topics, but we will serve anybody. Anybody who calls us will get our attention and time with one of our advocates on the line. But that is just our area of expertise. There are other agencies that are maybe better suited for somebody who doesn't fit in that category. And so we might refer them, but anyone is able to call us.
And you said domestic abuse, which means we're going to discuss the category of abuse extensively. That is basically what
Mm-hmm.
this episode's going to be about. But so this doesn't just necessarily mean within the couple. It could mean child abuse that would also fall into the category of Shalom Task Force.
So child abuse is not our number one area of expertise. We definitely have people reach out to us with those concerns. We are just as able to provide general support there, but it's our area of expertise. And we also might help provide information about the next best place to go. We absolutely are here if somebody doesn't know where to turn, either to provide them the support ourselves or to redirect them to the next best place.
Okay, wonderful. All right, now I'm glad we got that. Like that's the foundation. We know what we're talking
Yep.
about here. The reason that we wanted to have this conversation, we're both coming from such different perspectives, and I love that, and I love that like we're kind of a meeting of the minds here in that we're both seeing, I guess, two versions of the same thing. We're both seeing abuse being discussed a lot. And in some cases, that's a wonderful thing. And there are maybe some drawbacks to how much abuse is being discussed right now. And especially I think that, the main thing, what I really want to make sure that we get to in this conversation is for people to really feel a little bit more confident in understanding what abuse really is, that it's not, this kind of like very fluffy, confusing thing, but like we can get this to be a little bit of a more concrete working definition for people so that we can use it to support and to help those who need it, and also to not confuse those who might now go down the wrong path if that's not what they need, which obviously the first of the two is probably more important of the two, but both are downsides, right? Both are drawbacks. So we want to sort of get that clear a little bit. What are you seeing from your perspective?
So I think I just wanted to respond to another piece of what you shared, which was I think the idea that our dream is to never have any calls, but we know that abuse is happening. And so because we know that and we haven't, yet successfully eradicated abuse, the more calls we get, I think the more we see ourselves as successful. And I think that ultimately, even if people are not experiencing abuse, call us, right? That is part of what we can offer them is some information and guidance on what they're experiencing. But hopefully, if they've heard it here, they'll come into that call with a lot more clarity. And so, what we see people reaching out, definitely we see some cases that are like that textbook abuse, which we'll obviously talk about and define. And then we see people who are generally just confused about what they're experiencing in their relationship. And we'll see people who, will say something like, I don't know that this is the place for me, but somebody told me to call, so I figured I'd give it a try. So we're really seeing people calling in all different places in their journey of identifying what they're experiencing.
Okay, that's really helpful. And also people can call if they're concerned about a friend or a peer also, right? Like
Absolutely.
yeah.
So a large portion of our call volume is from what we call internally third-party callers, right? That's somebody who's calling on behalf of somebody else. And we are able to provide both, recognition on the emotional turmoil that might create if it's a loved one, right? If you're calling about like your sister, your child, right? There's a lot of pain that person's experiencing that often gets kind of shoved under the rug in service of the person who's experiencing the abuse. But also, people just don't quite know how to help. And so we can definitely provide information on both what survivors have told us, like people who have gotten out of the relationship, right? And they maybe, in different ways, right? Whether that's directly to Shalom Task Force, whether that's, right, just national statistics or, things like that, what people have said is most helpful to them. And we can help share that with people who call and say, like, here are just some things that we know to be helpful and some things that we know to be less helpful. And so we can provide that information to people who are calling worried about somebody that they care about, or even just a neighbor, somebody that they don't really know at all, but they're hearing things and they don't really know often, even if they have a responsibility to do something, what that something would be, and kind of grappling with, what do I do if I just know it's happening? Doesn't even need to be somebody I know.
Yeah. And I'm so glad the way that you said this, I think is going to already clear up maybe one concern that some people might have, which is it's so clear from hearing you speak that we are talking about or evidence-based response. This is research-oriented response. This is not you're going to call and find some lady who's going to schmooze with you and then tell you her opinions, right? That is not what this hotline is. And of course, to you, that's so obvious. But I think that for somebody who's not coming from this world, who doesn't even necessarily know how a hotline functions or operates, especially hearing that it's started by volunteers, it's really important to just remember that we're grounding this all in best practices and research and things like that.
Yep. Yeah. I think, one thing that it's my favorite fact about Shalom Task Force is that Shalom Task Force was founded before the Violence Against Women Act, the first time it was passed.
Wow.
Shalom Task Force predates that by about 2 years. And what I think is really neat about that is that means that the Orthodox Jewish world was thinking about this before the US, right? And I know you're in Israel. I know there's lots of different, people listening from different places, but I think before the US started to recognize it as a problem that needed both funding and research and support. And so, yeah, we were founded by volunteers at a time where there was no professional movement around domestic violence. And it's a little bit crazy to think that that was like 30 years ago or less, right? There was no professional movement at the time. So those volunteers were on par with what was happening in the rest of society, right? It was not a evidence-based movement at the time, but in that time since, right, that's when we've been able to really infuse a lot of what we do know about domestic violence, how it operates, what the field says about best practices. But yeah, it's, the volunteers, we've been really successful with that model because it creates that feeling of people feel safer talking to people who might be just more like them, right? I think there's sometimes a fear of talking to a professional, and I hope that fear can be, dissipated. Yeah. But I think that there is something really wonderful about talking to somebody who has been trained in it, understands it, has the information that they can offer and provide, but they're on the same level as you, right? We see our volunteers as helpers. They're people who are there to help. They are not there to come in and rescue somebody by giving their opinion or their advice or kind of what they would do. They're not your bubby.
Right.
Even if
and
they
they're
might.
not, and I love what you're saying. It's also true. So many people, and myself included, I totally get anxious around authority figures, right? It's something I am always coaching myself on and always working on. And so again, that feeling too, I know I'm not the only one where a professional can feel like an authority, and then you show up very differently in that situation, where when you keep it just peer to peer, then that creates a whole level of openness. Okay, I do want to circle back to this conversation about us throwing it around, but I'm realizing that it's probably much better for us to get really grounded in a working definition of abuse. Plus, I want to make sure that everyone gets that. So if they listen to the whole thing, kids come home from school, we're going to start with that piece. So
absolutely,
I'm handing this one over to the expert here. If someone's seeing something, someone's experiencing something, what are they looking for? How do we know?
So I think the best way to start this is really, right, you said a working definition. We have one that we use. It's very much all encompassing. Everything we'll talk about later, we can apply to that definition. And so the definition that we use is a pattern of behaviors that one partner uses to gain and maintain power and control in the relationship and instill fear in the relationship. And so we're talking about a pattern, right? We're not talking about a one-time behavior. We're talking about something that occurs and we'll talk about probably more later, in a cycle, right? This pattern. And we're talking about something where one partner there's an imbalance of power in the relationship, right? So when you're thinking of a couple, when you're thinking of a romantic relationship, when you're thinking of a marriage, you're thinking of people who should be on par with each other, right? Even if they have different roles, right? Especially, right, in different communities, you can have very clear differences in gender roles. Or you could just have a family where, like, one person is the math person and one person is not the math person, and the math person deals with the finances because their brain gets it, right? Those are different roles, but ultimately the balance of power in a relationship is expected to be, in sync. And what you get with domestic violence is one person actively gaining and maintaining that power and control. And then you have a marriage where somebody is not in control. And that's when we kind of talk about, like, they don't have a voice. So even if it's not their role, we want to make sure that both partners feel like they have a voice. Both people can feel safe, right? And I think that's that instill fear in the relationship pieces. There's also always this looming threat of, if you do something to try to up your power or to down my power to get us closer to even footing, there are consequences. And that's that fear. That's that fear piece that kind of is pretty much the thread that's like the glue that keeps the abuser's control there, is that fear.
Okay, so we're seeing pattern, we're seeing a power imbalance.
Yeah.
And we're seeing there's some kind of threat or fear.
Yep.
Intentionally being put in there.
Yep. Yep. So there's kind of this looming threat of some consequence if the other person were to try to do something to either, like I said, improve their space or bring the other person
Okay.
to a more level space.
I'm glad you brought that one up. I just want to give one example of where this could be confusing.
Mm-hmm.
So you gave the example of money, right? Like the one
Mm-hmm.
person's the numbers person's one person's not. And one thing that I learned about, which I didn't have before, which is this idea that like the person who owns an area needs to be the person who has the veto. So
Mm-hmm.
let's say one person has full responsibility for making sure that you match the budget, and the other person comes along and is like, "Hi, I want to paint all the walls." And
Mm-hmm.
then the person in charge of running the budget might be like, "No, we can't do that." So outside, I'm obviously not talking about an abusive relationship right now. I'm
Mm-hmm.
talking about a normal relationship, right? But that can already feel like very scary. Like, well, I was just vetoed. I was just totally told no. What's going on here? So
Mm-hmm.
then you followed up with this extra piece of like, it could be that one person is like, no, we can't do that. I mean, as we do that also. I mean, I do it all the time. You can't give the kids that. You can't do that. Like, right? We can say no. We can have areas where we feel our responsibility, but the other person isn't scared they'll be punished if they challenge that authority, right?
Mm-hmm.
When and that could become a conversation. So no does not equal abuse. No
Mm-hmm.
with consequences and fear is the red flag that we want to watch out
And
for.
and I think also just that other piece of like, is there a voice? Does somebody have a voice, right? So if you've kind of agreed that, right, one partner is the one who understands money, right, and so they primarily manage the budget. So yeah, they have the clear information, right? Like we can't swing that this month. It just like I'm looking at the numbers, we can't
Right.
swing it, right? And then, but let's say an example, maybe not like painting the room, but an example we often kind of use in training as we get people thinking about this is like you went over budget on the kids' clothing. And then there's this vacuum cleaner that you need, right? And so, like, what if there's two, but like now let's take away the vacuum cleaner, there's dinner, right? The kids need clothes and the kids need food, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, if somebody is in charge of the budget and then there's like I'm concerned, you're saying we don't have it, but also we need to figure this out. And there's then room to kind of problem solve it together
Mm-hmm.
versus kind of this very much like, nope, figure it out. I don't care if, you're the one who's causing our kids not to eat because you
Yeah.
spent too much money on clothes. So if there's also that kind of, then you get into that naming and blaming piece there. So I think ultimately, right, if the person has a voice to say, like, hey, I know it's really tight, but like, let's work this out together and there's room to figure that out, right? There's voice there. Somebody can speak up. There's room to express, or like, you know, oftentimes, let's say it isn't an issue of like there isn't money in the bank account, but an issue of just like this isn't how I decided we're spending the money, right? But if somebody could say like, is there room to try to adjust your budget that you made because we really do need both of these
Right.
things,
Right.
you know? And I think another thing is right, we think about this when there are lots of expenses for people in there, right? Especially in this day and age, but add on day school tuition, add on kosher food, right? There's like a lot of expenses, but there are also people who are on a very strict budget and it's not for lack of money. And I think that's another space where you start like, if there's a budget because that is the responsible thing to do, or is there a budget where somebody's getting an allowance that is a much smaller portion of what the family can actually afford,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if somebody knows that there is plenty of money from just knows enough to know what the salaries are, or things like that, and they're still not allowed to spend certain
Right.
things, that's also where you might see that, right? It's not like they made the budget, but they made the budget in an unreasonably narrow way. So I
Yeah.
think that also,
And we can go back
right?
to the power balance here because like your
Yeah.
paradigm really covers everything because again, right, I'm like always my brain's going to all the
Yeah.
exceptions, right? You
Yeah.
keep me focused here. But then let's say we have a person who has financial trauma or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so they're extremely tight on the budget, but they wouldn't then spend themselves and only allow their partner to spend very little,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
They would be it would be across the board. So we
Yep.
want to leave room, I guess is what I'm saying, for there's lots of different versions of unhealthy, right?
Yes.
And the more information you have, the more empowered you are to find out what solution you need. And that's really what I
Mm-hmm.
think we're both trying to
Mm-hmm.
provide here is how do we figure out if we're looking at an abusive situation, an unhealthy situation, two people who are massively sleep deprived and just need a break,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or,
Yep.
what's normative, what's not normative, and which
Yep.
version of not normative are we talking about?
Yep.
So you didn't say anything about hitting. And I know you wanted
Hmm.
to talk about this.
Yep.
So
So I
what's
think
the
it's one
deal?
of the, yeah, so it's one of the biggest myths, I think, and that is just like really hard to squash, that abuse is specifically physical violence. We hear from survivors all the time that actually the physical violence is sometimes the least notable piece to them. And that
Mhm.
really what we're talking about, right? So we were talking a lot about financial abuse just now as we kind of got to that example, but we're talking about emotional abuse, verbal abuse. We're talking about religious abuse. There's definitely, there are examples of how somebody might pit somebody between their relationship, with God. There's sexual abuse, right? Which is also often physical, but it's not always. It doesn't always overlap. And all of these types of abuse, right? I think emotional is often a thread, right? It is a slow, steady degrading of somebody's sense of self and sense of self-worth and sense of self-esteem. And that might be done using verbal tactics, right? Like put downs, insults. That might be done by gaslighting, right? Which is kind of this psychological abuse of, you know, basically causing somebody to call their own sense of reality into question. That's also done by just blaming in general, right? Like, if you didn't do this, this wouldn't happen. And over time, those messages start to just become internalized by somebody, because if you hear it enough times by somebody you expect it and you probably still do love, right? People can love their abusers. It's feelings are not like so simple. They're complex. And so all of these other types of abuse are really, that is what abuse is. And physical abuse is one tactic, right? We talk about like almost the toolkit for an abuser, right? How does an abuser abuse? And there is kind of this predictable toolkit, right? It's all of these types of abuse. And physical is just one of those types. But we hear from people all the time that they go to get support from a friend, a community member, and they're told nothing physical is happening, it's not abuse. And I think if you think back to that definition, right, pattern of behaviors, those behaviors can be physical, but more often they're any number of those other types of abuse, right? A pattern of behaviors that one partner uses to gain and maintain power and control in the relationship and instill fear. That I've never met, I didn't mention physical at all there, right? There is nothing about that that is inherently physical. And what we often find, right? I often say, like, back when I was doing more teen education programming on dating violence, somebody showed up to a first date and they got slapped in the face, they probably would not come back, right? There probably wouldn't be a second date. And I think if you think about how these things develop in a kind of cyclical but slow pattern, right? That's when you might see escalation to physical violence, but you're likely not seeing that at the beginning, because usually it takes time for the abuser to gain that power, gain that control. And only once that control is there might you see that escalation to physical. And so, yeah, so I'm kind of describing the cycle, and I'll just jump in and actually describe it, right? There's a very kind of well documented cycle of, and it's often depicted in a circle. I happen to like a wave model, which kind of shows that it also, like, the cycle keeps going, but it changes over time, both in intensity and frequency. But the cycle basically, right, there's this honeymoon period, and that's both at the beginning of a relationship, right, during courting, during maybe early dating. And that's like often people will describe, when they're describing an abusive relationship from the other side, maybe they've gotten out and they've kind of done a lot of time, spent a lot of time healing. They'll describe that the highs in an abusive relationship are way higher than the highs in a healthy relationship. And that's not an accident, right? The abuser is kind of having these, sometimes it's big gestures, sometimes it's, just really loving, sometimes it's gifts, right? Whatever that is for that in that couple, there's a feeling of calm, and often more than calm, there's a feeling of like wonderful, right? It's a really wonderful time, sometimes more wonderful than other relationships, right? And then you kind of move into this tension building phase, which is where, right, you're starting to see that tension building, right? And that's where you'll start to see, right, like a peppering in of those things I described, right? Letdowns, blaming, yelling, cursing. Sometimes also, like, a thing that comes up a lot is the silent treatment, right? Controlling when conversation can happen. You might see,
Isolating
any of
also,
those.
isn't that a big one? Like
Yep.
isolating the
Yep.
partner from her friends or his friends.
Yeah. And so you'll see with isolation, it's often, it's often done part of almost this like sweet, it often has this sweet thing. Like, I really just, I want to spend time with you. I know you were going to go out with your friends, but I really want to spend time with you. Or like, I just don't love those friends. I just don't really like those ones, right? Or, I really, I have a really hard time when we spend all of, a whole weekend with your family. And then the next time I have a really hard time when we spend a day with your family, right? So it's slow, it's deliberate, it's not like, 0 to 60 where, but it's this building over time. And sometimes, it's really sweet. I want to spend more time with you because I love you, right? So I need you. And then there's this kind of slow, thing where like the person is flaking on their friends a lot. Their friends inherently, reasonably so, start to pull back, right? And so then the person finds themselves feeling like they have nobody to turn to. And that was not an accident in that, right? Abusers aren't necessarily sitting there planning this out, but it all comes from this framework of, right, the abuser believes, it is their fundamental belief that they have the right to control. And so that kind of enables them to do these things in a way where it is deliberate. It's not like there's not like a clear, like they don't have a secret notebook with a plan, right? But they're leaning into these tools, right, that they've kind of created for themselves. And so you have that isolation, right? And then ultimately going kind of in that cycle, then you have usually an explosive incident. And so that, might be physical, but it might be yelling, it might be, right, silent treatment, just completely disconnecting and saying, I control when we talk. It might be breaking something or when going back to finances, right? Cutting an allowance if that's part of the abuse that's happening. And then usually you find that there is now another period of calm. So that kind of then starts to bring the person back in. And what that really does is it creates hope, right? Like I know that this relationship can be great. And if I just figure out how to stay here and not have the other part of the cycle, right? Stay in this honeymoon place. I know it can be done because it keeps happening. There's also, right, just like there's there's the feeling of love. I love this person when they're like this, right?
Mhm.
I don't quite love them when they're like that, but I love them when they're like this. And so that kind of creates that it's really confusing for somebody, right? How do I make sense of the fact that sometimes my husband or my wife or my partner is like this, and sometimes they're like that. And there's often promises of not doing it again, right? So you'll see, right? I know I should not have done that. I just lost my temper, right? And we can talk a little bit more about that idea of losing temper, right? I just lost my temper. I promise I won't do it again. And of course, they do it again because it's a cycle. But each time those promises maybe even get bigger, right? I will do anything to show you that I won't do it again, right? Whatever that is. And ultimately that cycle kind of just it continues to fester. And then that's where you might see escalation. The more times you go around that circle, if you're doing the circle model, right, the often quicker you go around that circle and the higher intensity those explosive incidents might be.
This is a little bit like off topic, but I mean, it's not off topic, but not in the same, whatever. What are we seeing now in terms of statistics for male versus female abusers? And obviously reporting is going to be very different. I'm assuming. What's the story now?
So it's a really good question. And I know that, the CDC comes out with statistics and, other bodies come out with statistics. And the numbers are definitely right. We definitely know that there is a higher prevalence of abuse happening from male perpetrators to female survivors. There's a lot of reasons for that. Some of it has to do with kind of the just inherent ideas of masculinity in society, and that it's just kind of it primes people who maybe were already possibly at risk of being an abuser, right? It primes them and kind of it gives them that like empowerment to move ahead. But also I think, well, no, that right, reporting is really messy, especially for something where, people don't want to come forward. So I would definitely say that probably both are underreported. That's just kind of a guess.
Yeah.
But, we definitely do hear from men who are being abused for sure. I also, I think there's also a reporting bias where we've normalized it more for women to come forward and the barriers are different for men. And so they may also come forward in a different way, or it might be harder to come forward. And then there are definitely also, right, there's abuse happening in same-sex relationships. It does not discriminate, unfortunately. And so I don't love citing the actual numbers that we have because you know, they're evidence-based, they're means tested, they're all of those things. But think that unfortunately the prevalence is just too many.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's very helpful. So I want to discuss, I want to keep coming back to your framework
Mm-hmm.
and now bring in unhealthy relationships,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's unhealthy to the degree that maybe they're going to end up breaking up, or unhealthy in that they maybe have, like we said, well, we were schmoozing before, but a couple with dealing with complex trauma or with mental health diagnosis or lack of diagnosis,
Mm-hmm.
or whatever the thing might be, there once someone's just going through an extremely challenging
Mm-hmm.
period of life and does
Yeah.
not have the tools to deal with it. So how can we, like you gave the example of, say, of somebody losing their temper,
Yep.
okay? Most couples fight,
Yep.
right? And most of, often when I speak to women, they are extremely flooded and overwhelmed after that fight,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's
Yeah.
very normal to not just fight, but to feel like something
Mm-hmm.
dangerous is happening.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we use your paradigm to, again, give ourselves a check of, is
Mm-hmm.
this something that we need to make sure that we're getting some support, speak to Shalom Task Force or someone else that's a professional in this area,
Yep.
versus, and then let's make sure that we go into also like why that
Mm-hmm.
might be different.
Yep. So I think we like to think about it often as a relationship spectrum. So you kind of have healthy, and in healthy, we also talk about healthy enough, right? Not every relationship is going to quite have it figured out. Most probably won't, but healthy enough, right, means that there's a general idea of safety. There's a general feeling of having some tools to navigate these stressors, right? And then you move into maybe what we call unhealthy, maybe even a little bit toxic, right? And that is likely to feel, right? I'm not going to say that that pain is any less significant than somebody experiencing abuse, right? They're different, but they're both equally painful often. And so I think recognizing that nobody's saying if you're not experiencing abuse, your pain doesn't matter, right? That pain is real, and being hurt in a relationship is painful. But I think if you are trying to find a way to tease those apart, I think it comes back to that idea of power imbalance. So if two people hold the same amount of power, it's just not quite where you want to be, right? If the power is the same, but they're both fighting all the time and they're both kind of hurting each other, right? That wouldn't meet that criteria for abuse, because it's not imbalanced. There's not an imbalance of power. There's not one partner gaining and maintaining power and control over the other. And you definitely will see, though, right, that in abuse, sometimes you will see somebody who occasionally, right, as much as they don't have the power, they will do something when they feel particularly scared, or when it's kind of built up so much, and they might respond with even maybe the first bit of physical violence in the relationship might be coming from the survivor, right? I felt so scared and threatened, right, that I pushed, right, or something like that. But I think you're looking at, again, it's that pattern, and it's looking at it over time, and it's looking at how it built and how it developed. And if you kind of look at any isolated moment, you won't be able to tell, right? There isn't really a good way to identify that. And ultimately, it's about, right, that imbalance of power. And I think if you think about that imbalance of power, again, your pain is right, if you have the same amount of power and you're both hurting, your pain is no less significant. The things you might do to get support, right, might be different. Both sets of people can call Shalom Task Force, because Shalom Task Force is available to provide support to people struggling in relationship, that or like you said, people worried about somebody struggling in relationships. So it's not that, like, if you don't meet the criteria for abuse, you cannot call Shalom Task Force. Absolutely not. But that's something that can help somebody kind of start to make sense of their own experience.
Let's just talk a little bit about why we might want to go a different route if
Mm-hmm.
it's clearly an abusive situation, versus, like, I'll give you mine first, and then I want you to share
Mm-hmm.
yours. So for me, a lot of what I do is relationship education, understanding differences between communication and things like that. What I worry about, Baruch Hashem, I've never experienced this to my knowledge inside of it with any of the people that I've worked with, but what I worry about is that the more that we focus on understanding the other partner, I guess for my women working to understand their husbands, the more she's going to just keep trying to twist herself into a pretzel to
Mm-hmm.
appease and try
Mm-hmm.
and get back to that sweet spot of the
Mm-hmm.
relationship. As opposed to, it's almost like it just gives her one more rabbit hole to go down
Mm-hmm.
before she has to just step back and address, like, what is really going on right now in this
Mm-hmm.
relationship. And so that's the reason that I really just encourage people not to work with me or similar type coaches. It's is this information super valuable and life-changing? Yes. Is it what you need to be doing if you're in an abusive relationship? No, it's not your next step. And so, yeah, that's from my side.
Yeah. So I think one thing even that I just, as you were describing, kind of twisting up into a pretzel, I often also think about, right, somebody experiencing abuse is also probably making themselves very small, right? To protect themselves, they can't present their full self. And so I think, right, if you see somebody making themselves small, again, that might look like, right, oh, somebody who just doesn't know how to communicate. But what we know is that oftentimes we ultimately the survivor, the person in the relationship, is the best expert at keeping themselves safe. And so what might seem super obvious to you or me of what they should be doing, they know that isn't the right choice. They've been able to kind of almost like it's a game of trial and error often, right? Like I did this and it had consequences, so I'm not going to do that again. And they often people in these experiences, right, in these relationships can really tell you like I spend so much energy and time figuring out what not to do. I've done a pretty good job at that and I know how to kind of keep things more at bay, right? I know what not to do, but that's the person, right, kind of that's part of their slow kind of degrading of their sense of self, right? They are making themselves really small in order to stay safe. And I think that what often happens though is, right, the person who is the survivor in the relationship, right, is the person. And when I say survivor, a lot of times people often kind of, I'm just going to do a tangent here, but think that I'm talking to only somebody who has gotten out. But I think if you think about the amount of survival that is happening in an abusive relationship at any given moment, I think you'll start to recognize, no, I'm using survivor to mean somebody who is being harmed by their abuser in their relationship, because they are, every moment is a test of survival, because ultimately the kind of highest point of escalation is homicide. And thankfully, we have a number of resources in place as a society to help protect from that. But that is kind of the ultimate escalation, right, of an abuse arc would be homicide. And so somebody is doing what they need to do to keep themselves safe. And so that was my tangent on language. Let me try to get back where I was. But a survivor knows their safety needs best. And so you or I can't tell them what to do. And that's why we right on the hotline, but also when we're talking to people about caring for a friend, do not tell a survivor that they need to leave. I think that's, we were talking a little bit earlier when we were schmoozing about kind of people crowdsourcing relationship advice, from Facebook when they don't know where else to turn. And often you'll see like somebody will share kind of often, right? Thankfully, Facebook finally figured out that anonymous posting option, and people will share really harrowing situations. And you'll see like hundreds of comments, one after the other, run, right? All caps, exclamation points, get out of there, right? And I think what is missing there is this idea that the person can't necessarily safely run. Running, right, if we're talking about that imbalance of power and we're talking about kind of the consequence of one person, right, the survivor trying to increase their power to be on par, right, leaving is the biggest shift to that power dynamic. And so it's also the most dangerous time in a relationship, right? It is the time where the ante is up as high as it can be, right? And that's why, right, that's where you most commonly see, right, severe injury, right, lethality, homicide. That is the moment that it is most dangerous. And most survivors, even if they've never heard somebody speak about this, just know that inherently. It's intuitive. They feel it in their core that leaving would put them at risk. And so I think remembering that kind of they are the expert in what is safest for them, and that can allow you then to figure out kind of next steps. And I think for anybody who is a survivor who might be listening to this, remembering to give yourself the credit that you are the expert in what is safest for you. And as much as it would be super, like, people would love, I would love to be able to, right? Somebody calls the hotline and says, what do I do? I'd love to be able to tell somebody the answer, but I don't know, right, what is safest, because I'm not in that relationship. So that was kind of a tangent. I apologize, but I think that in thinking about then what are some options, right, for somebody who maybe either thinks they might, right, has kind of identified that they might be in an abusive relationship, isn't quite sure, but they're wondering, right? So ultimately, therapy can be a tremendously valuable resource, right, for giving somebody both tools, right, some concrete skills of navigating things, as well as space to just process what they're experiencing and figure out what that means for them and what kind of weighing different pieces. And that can be a slow process, right? That people could be in therapy for years trying to figure this out. Some people might, find that they just needed some clarity, and then, they might make a decision. But ultimately, we talked earlier about, right, that kind of fear of authority, that fear of kind of a professional, and ultimately just, it's about fit. I often talk about, right, when you're seeking a professional, date your therapist, right? You're not going to necessarily pick the first one that you were referred to or that had space or things like that. But ultimately, right, there are therapists who are really well, right, they are well equipped to provide support to people, both who have no plans to leave the relationship. There are people who stay in abusive relationships for ever or for many, many years for so many reasons. And I feel like we can have a whole nother conversation about that, right? But there are gazillions of reasons why somebody might choose to stay. Some of that is just basic safety. They know that leaving is more dangerous, and they aren't able or willing to take that significant risk. But then there's all sorts of community factors. People
I think
will
that's
often.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I think it's, when I'm thinking through all the objections someone might have of calling and asking for help. So we already addressed, well, I'm not sure if this is abuse or not. Doesn't matter. Shalom Task Force is going to help you regardless of the situation. And another one is they'll just tell me to leave. And
Yep.
if you're saying they already know that they can't do that. So now saying, no, how can we support you based on your decisions and what you're going to do? This person still gets to be the authority. And
Yep.
I think that creates such a safety,
Yep.
not to go
And
from just one power play to another
yep.
person saying, this is what you need to be doing.
Yep. And I think what we find sometimes is that people who have spent so much of their life being told what to do, they actually can feel very overwhelmed by somebody giving them choice. But we definitely, right, we don't want to mimic the tactics of the abuser in an attempt to help somebody, right? Even if the intentions are good, we really want to make space. I think a lot of what I talk about, the goal of the hotline, is we are holding space for somebody, right? Like, I often think about it when I'm talking to some of our volunteers as we're training new ones, right? If, somebody has this really heavy backpack, and for an hour, you can hold it for them for 40 minutes, for half an hour, whatever it is, 20 minutes, right? However long somebody stays on, that's not going to make the backpack no longer, right? At the end of that time, you have to give them back their backpack, right? Like, that's kind of, but having 20 minutes of no backpack might be enough for you to stretch yourself out, right? To kind of get some relief, and to kind of enable you then to take the backpack back it feels different, right? After having a break. And so I think often, like, it's somebody who can hold space for you, who can kind of carry that with you for the time that you're on with them, and we believe you. I think that's a big thing, right? Like, there's so many people who will talk to other people, and, like, it's not uncommon, though there are also plenty of abusers who don't fit this description. But for abusers to be huge balei chesed, leaders in the community, you know, people who are on, volunteer EMT, right? Hatzalah, they're, donating their time, their money, their energy. People love them. They give multiple shares and classes and all of those things, right, for the community. And so it makes it really hard if somebody does choose to speak up, because that's like a completely different version of this person, right? And that's not uncommon, right? Nobody will believe me because what I'm describing is a complete opposite to what what is being seen by the general public. And I think that knowing that you have a place to call where you will be believed, right, that is inherently, I think, just a tremendous value. And and that's why we're here. We're here to make sure that you have a space where you feel believed.
If you do think that it's a abusive situation, it's a great idea to talk to Shalom Task Force. What would, other than like marriage classes or things like that, where we're getting very into communication or like motivations or things like that, what else might not be a great choice?
Absolutely. So, I think when I talk about therapy, right, I was kind of really focused on the idea of individual therapy, right? Therapy to provide skills or just a space for somebody to process. And that is, right, an individual therapy relationship. That is the survivor seeking therapy for themselves. When it comes to kind of a lot of people kind of jump straight to, I need couples therapy to fix my relationship. If I'm going to kind of be able to hold on to this relationship, I don't want it to end for, again, gazillion reasons. Some of it might even be like, I was married once before already. I can't be the person who's been divorced twice, right? Like, that might even be enough of a societal stigma and shame to keep somebody in the relationship. And so they see, I need to do something. It kind of, there's this obvious, oh, couples therapy. And I think what, is key to understand when you're talking about this imbalance of power is that there's two main risks, I think, overall. One is that, right, we talked about abusers often being very charming, being very well loved, and even the best therapist may not be able to see through that because they are making assessments based on what they're being given, right? What's coming up in the room. And if they're getting a very different picture, right, there are some survivors who present not very put together because they've been, right, if you think about kind of the way trauma impacts the brain, they might be stunted at kind of where the trauma started. So if they got married at 18, at 20, at 25, right, you might be talking to somebody 20 years later, 5 years later even, and you're getting a very different presentation, right? You're getting somebody who might not present like your star client, right? And then you're getting their spouse who's presenting as this star person. And so even the best therapist really may not be able to pick up on that because the abuser won't let it happen. And so that just creates a risk of, first of all, it just not being effective. But then what often happens, right, for therapy to be effective, right, the therapist has to create safety for vulnerability. And also then somebody needs to ultimately be vulnerable. And therapy is a very vulnerable space. And if the person who's, right, the survivor in the relationship is working really hard to do everything they can to try to improve the relationship, and meanwhile they have a partner who's not doing anything, they're not putting any work to improve the relationship, right? Then you get somebody being vulnerable in session where there is a third party, right? And then as soon as you leave, all of that vulnerability that was shared and open is ripe for being turned into kind of incorporated into tactics of abuse.
And it gets weaponized essentially.
Yep. Absolutely. And so that's where there can be really a lack of safety that can absolutely come from couples therapy when there's abuse. So we very much say couples therapy when there's abuse is completely contraindicated. It's not effective and it's not safe. And obviously safety is the number one priority. And so we see, right, people though they're confused by that, right? They're like, but I thought couples therapy is the thing I do when my marriage is not going smoothly. And so we will provide that, most often people will already tell us that they figured it out. They just haven't quite made that link. So they'll say like, we've been seeing a couples therapist, it's not helping at all. Or, my husband is so charming or my wife is so charming, right? That I don't think the therapist will understand what's going on. Like they'll tell us those things and then we'll often just kind of link it to what we know about couples therapy. But they're really, right, I think so much of what we don't give enough credit to is the survivor knows all of these things, right? They're all things that they've known kind of deep in their core, having survived this abuse for however long they've been enduring the abuse. But sometimes just giving that clarity of like, that is what you're saying, that's not just you, that's a thing, right? That's a thing that makes sense. It makes sense in a larger context and it makes sense exactly as you're describing, right? Your fear about couples therapy is because you should be scared, right? There is a reason to fear that, and I think that, right, when we're talking about kind of some of those other things, right? And what I will say is Shalom Task Force, right, on the hotline, we can't assess whether it's abuse or not. That's just not, we don't have enough time, data. We don't get to know callers in that way. That's one of kind of, we are an anonymous hotline. You can share however much information you'd like, but ultimately, right, we are anonymous, and each time you call, it is its own support. So there isn't a developing of an ongoing relationship with a person who calls or texts us. And so we can't make that assessment for you. And so oftentimes, right, the best way to assess that is to at least start the work individually. And maybe then you'll start to get some clarity. And maybe then, right, you might move into like, oh, okay, I really don't think there's abuse here. Maybe couples therapy would be warranted. But I think that we very much err on the side of safety, and we are very careful not to put somebody at risk, and that, right, giving a couples therapy referral very much often could put them at risk.
But if you're talking, want to say really quick, just so there's not a misunderstanding, you don't have to go to an individual therapist to confirm abuse if you already know it's abusive.
Correct.
If you know you're in an abusive relationship, that is all the information that you need.
Yep.
I just wanted to make sure that was super clear. No one was thinking that they, need a stamp of approval from somebody.
Absolutely. That is a really good point. Yeah, that is a really good point, right? The therapist might be somebody who can help you navigate it if you don't know and you need the space to think that through. But absolutely no, you are the one who determines, right, what you're experiencing. And there's no official, checkbox that you need to hit for somebody to tell you, yep, that's abuse, and I think that, so, right, but in addition to that, some people, right, don't have any interest in seeing a therapist for any number of reasons, right? There's some really fantastic books that exist. One that we really refer people to a lot is Lisa Tversky's I'm So Confused, Am I Being Abused? It's a book that really outlines kind of very slowly, right, a lot of these dynamics, and then somebody can kind of read it, and you're not going to hit everything, right? No abusive relationship is going to be abusive in every single possible way, but if you start noticing and seeing things in the book that is what you're experiencing, right, that can provide some clarity. And sometimes it's just people will call us for years, right? We don't have an ongoing relationship, but they'll tell us, right? I've called, for years and I'm just trying, like they're still just trying to figure it out, and that's okay too. There's no one timeline or pace that anybody needs to go through this journey.
So I want to circle back to this original conversation, which is, I don't know what's the chicken and what's the egg here.
Mhm.
Is it that, I mean, then it doesn't matter. Maybe more and more people started to understand abuse and the nuances of abuse, that it's not just some guy beating up some girl, but that there's the whole pattern and there's a whole history, and it's not just physical and all of these things, right? And so now people, especially we're talking about, the Facebook, what's your phrase? It was so good that I love.
Oh, crowdsourcing
Crowdsourcing marriage
relationship.
information. Yes. Right. So the crowdsourcing, then, maybe more people started to be able to identify that's abusive, that's abusive. But then at some point, the scales tipped, and now it just seems like it's becoming like there's this watershed of like so many things are just immediately right off the bat. And that really, really concerns me. You said also you've experienced it from the other side, where sometimes things should be, why aren't people? So, there's just the Facebook algorithm for you, showing you that we're seeing our thing. Concerns me the most is that now we sort of circled around where now, oh, if everyone's just calling it abuse, then it's never abuse. Right? Like
And
yeah.
And so I think, like you said, it's not just the Facebook algorithm, though that's true too. But I think there is some degree of probably, right, sampling bias and, right, the work that I'm doing and the work that you're doing and what you're seeing. But I think that, I haven't seen as much of that, right? I think that idea of like everything's abuse, let's just kind of like throw it all under a catch-all and kind of then take away the meaning of abuse. I haven't come across that as much. I'm sure you have, right? But I think that speaks to the difference in just who's reaching out to who. And I think that this conversation provides insight either way, right? It's I am being abused. Somebody like listens to this and goes like, oh, that does fit what I'm doing, right? What I'm experiencing. Or you have the opposite where somebody's like, oh no, that doesn't quite fit. Let me figure out what is happening, right? That kind of working definition can very much be very helpful either way. But I think, in thinking about this idea of kind of everything being labeled as abuse and kind of what does that mean, I think it's also just really important to be cautious, because that is a tool that abusers can use, right?
Please explain why. I think this is really important.
Yeah, so basically I think that there are definitely abusers who can hide behind this idea like, well, everyone's calling everything abuse these days, like here I am now, I'm being accused to being an abuser. And there's also kind of this myth, and our legal team, I'll add, I've mentioned our education department a little bit. We also have a legal team, and they provide free support to survivors of domestic violence. The degree of support depends on a number of factors, both geography, but and just capacity. But they are there to answer legal questions. Legal questions might be around finances or custody if you choose to leave. Legal questions might be around, who owns what parts of the house, right? There's a lot of legal nuances, right, when you're talking about separating. But also, even if you're not looking to separate, you just kind of want to understand, like, what are your rights, right? That is our legal team. They are really skilled at this. This is the work that they do day in and day out. They really know, right, how to provide guidance, right? So legal advice, as well as just kind of legal information. But I bring that up because there's kind of often this myth that, like, once somebody claims abuse in the court system, they're like, okay, straight shot to getting custody. And it's like almost seen as like this tactic that somebody might use if they want custody and they want to kind of manipulate the courts. But what they're seeing in reality is no, if somebody's bringing up abuse, that makes the case way harder. It is not a good strategy to try to like shoot straight through to get custody. Once abuse is mentioned, the case gets much harder. And so it is unlikely, right, that an attorney is going to use a strategy that is a short shot to making their job harder. But I think that myth carries momentum, right? This idea that, like, you want custody, it's a messy divorce, people just aren't kind of getting along, say abuse and you're golden, right? Like, that myth, unfortunately, right, can be very harmful, and it it picks up momentum.
Because
And it's
let's just make sure that I want to make sure it's
yeah,
all that clear, crystal clear, because it invalidates the person coming out and actually saying this is abuse, right? That myth can then be like used as a defense to sort of confuse everybody
yeah,
about what's actually happening. Yeah.
yeah. And so then, right, so then abusers are saying like, I'm not abusive. My hope soon to be ex just wants custody, right? So it kind of it tries to kind of reframe the situation. And I think that can happen also with this idea of like, oh, well, everyone's calling everything abuse these days. I'm not an abuser. I'm just a victim, right? You often will see abusers say like, I'm just a victim in this kind of labeling of abuse, right? And I think that the ability for abusers to use that, right, I think is a big risk. And I just, I think while people might be talking about abuse more, and I definitely hear plenty of people joking about it, right? Like somebody be like, "Oh yeah, he abuses me all the time," right? But in
Yeah.
jest, which is I personally
Uh-huh.
don't find funny. I personally don't find funny, and I think I have some friends who have made very clear, like I'll be like, "I'm leaving this conversation
Yeah.
until you're done with that line of humor that you're finding funny." But I think that I haven't really seen as much of what you're describing of kind of like behaviors being labeled as abusive, just kind of willy-nilly. It's the best phrase that comes to mind, but like I think that, you know, it but ultimately, right, just providing this clarity, this education on what is abuse will serve either of those, right? Those
Problems
avenues, right?
that come from it.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. And I think what you said earlier really helps sort of highlight what's going on my screen, which
Yeah.
is that you can't just take one snapshot of a relationship and know,
Yeah.
because it's a
Yeah.
pattern, you need the whole picture. And I think
Yeah.
that someone's not necessarily wrong in saying the thing you're describing sounds like abuse, because it would if it's part of a pattern, which it
Yeah.
might be.
Yeah.
But it also, coming from where I am, where I work with much more normative relationships, I'm like, no, that sounds like what my client just described to me last night, because her husband got laid off and like fried, or like,
Yeah.
and I know this couple, and I've worked with them, and I know that they're fine, and this is not,
Yeah.
so I think that, yeah, again, like coming back to this paradigm over and over is exactly like, again, this isn't, I don't want to say it's not complicated, but I want to say it's not mysterious. It's not,
Mhm.
something that like we can't access. There is a working definition,
Mhm.
and there are things that we can look for so that we can get people the help that
Yeah.
they need.
I think, yeah, you're exact, right. Highlighting that idea of like any behavior, right, cannot be ultimately used to determine abuse. And I think like the conversation around is that an abusive behavior is kind of then not really, you can't really answer that, right? That's not really something that can be answered, but is something an abusive tactic, right? That speaks to that behavior being used as part of that pattern. And so I think, if somebody comes
Yeah.
to you with an isolated thing or even a handful of things, right? But you don't have that picture of that the couple's relationship, that whether there's fear, right? And the fear, right, we talked about, I think you mentioned a little bit earlier, right? Like fights can be scary, but there's a difference between just a fight being scary and that kind of inherent undertone of fear in the relationship that is being cultivated, right, in this kind of ongoing cyclical manner.
Yeah. 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 Okay. What does Shalom Task Force need for those people who are listening to this? Now they have more education. Hopefully, they can be advocates for people in their lives if,
Mhm.
God forbid, they're in the situation where they need to. But let's say that they're hearing this and they're like, oh my gosh, this is amazing work. I want to help. I want to be
Mhm.
involved. I just want to give you a chance to kind of make a pitch, whatever would be helpful.
Absolutely. So I think, right, we kind of talked a little bit about, our education department. Our education department reaches thousands and thousands of people each year, but we want to reach more. We want to be able to really spread this message as far and wide as possible. And sometimes that's a one-time thing with like a very kind of basic overview. And sometimes in certain settings that might be a kind of a repetitive, right, like a longer process. And so I think the first thing is like, if you're hearing this and you want to hear more, or if you're hearing this and there's a space where you think it would be helpful, maybe you're a college teacher who has a group, right? And you bring us in. Maybe you're a college, right? Like a yeshiva, something, right? And you have a group of people. Maybe you're a rabbi and you want to bring us to your shul. Maybe you are, you know, any community space, right? Maybe you're just another organization that has people who could stand to learn about this. Whatever that is, I think just reach out, you can set up something for us to provide that education, because I think the more people that understand this, the more people that have this message, the more we can do as a community to help the people in need, and the better we can help those people in need, right? Because if you understand abuse better, then you understand, right? Like we talked about, like, don't just tell somebody to run, right? That is not going to be helpful. And so I think and then anybody hearing this, like, make this Shabbos table conversation, bring this up with your family, bring this up with your coworkers in the break room, whatever that is. Like, just please help us provide this education, be ambassadors for us. I think that would really be, a very, very important thing, because also, like I said earlier, we know that we would love that one day we don't get any calls. But right now, if we're not getting calls, that means people don't know, not that it's not happening. And so I think the more people that know, and the more people that understand both what abuse is, that there are places, right, like Shalom Task Force, to provide that support, the better they can be helped. And so I think just like that is, I think the most important thing is kind of knowledge is power, right? And so if people have the knowledge of this information, they can make safer choices. And also, right, we'd love for people to come to us earlier in the game, right? Where they're like, we have people who call and we talk about, right, this idea of an O feeling, and like, just getting a sense before you're right deep into the relationship. So that's
I was
kind of,
gonna,
I
I was
think,
gonna ask about
yeah,
dating, because I know I do have a lot of people
yep,
listening who aren't yet married, who are in the dating
yep,
process. So that's great to know that they can also call
yep,
if they're not so sure.
yep. And just even somebody who's like, I am a complete novice at dating and I have no idea what I'm dealing with, right? Getting some kind of just education right on like that idea of an uh-oh feeling. What is it? What might it be like? What would be a red flag, right? Some of those conversations. And then our education workshops do that too, right? We go into high schools, but we also can go into lots of other spaces with those dating workshops as well. So I would definitely say that's number one. And then obviously the world runs on money. Definitely donations are very helpful for us to be able to maintain the work that we do. So definitely there is no harm ever in supporting the agency with a financial donation.
Thank you so much for coming on, having this super open and very, very important conversation.
Yeah.
And thank you for taking the time.
Thank you for having me. I think, I, as much as we talk about sometimes among the staff, right? Like domestic violence is a really gruesome topic to talk about, but also, right, I think it's okay for us to feel passionate and excited about the work that we do. And so I just really want to thank you for giving me a platform to share that. And I guess I want to end on just one really, I guess, like often nice to end on a glimmer of hope when we talk about, something so deep. And I think, what we are seeing as we go into more schools, and if you're listening and you either are part of a school or you are a parent with a kid in a school, like we love going into schools because it's our chance to make a change much earlier, right? To provide that education to people when they're younger, right? That they may not have had. That, I think there's definitely, you're able to see that as the next generation of people who maybe have had some of that education are getting into their next phase of their life. You see the questions are a little bit different. And sometimes it is more of that, like, I'm just not sure what's going on here. I have that oh feeling. I don't know, even like, is this okay? Is this not? And I think like just really recognizing that like today's young people are getting it. And I think that, you know, we again, we want to get to zero calls. I don't think we're there anytime soon, but the more that people understand domestic violence, the closer we are to that point.
All right. All right. It's a sham. Zero calls. We're all going to daven for. In the meantime, we're going to spread the word.
Yep,
Thank you again.
absolutely. Thank you.